966.
Speaking with us now on the 966, Dr. Jon Alterman from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Jon is a Senior Vice President and Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy and Director, Middle East Program at CSIS. Our listeners and viewers will know he's a returning guest to the 966. And Jon is also host of the absolutely must-listen-to podcast from CSIS called Babel, Translating the Middle East. It's terrific. You have to listen to it if you haven't done it so yet. Dr. Alterman, welcome back. Great to see you again.
Thanks, Lucian. Great to see you too.
Wonderful to have you, Jon. You are, if we had levels, you're now up to the platinum level, 966 platinum level. It's a dubious achievement, but
although I've flown enough on airlines that I realize that platinum has become sort of a middling level.
Well, all right, we'll have to come up with something. Something that's really rare, like a rare earth mineral. Next
Royal level.
Jon, as we know, President Joe Biden recently returned from a much discussed trip to Israel, Palestine, and Saudi Arabia. I will say this, scientists and engineers refer to what's called the signal to noise ratio. And, basically it's the power of a signal, which is meaningful input, to the power of background noise, which is meaningless or unwanted input. And if it's 1-to-1, then the signal is strong. There's so much background noise and that sort of thing surrounding this trip, and it's kind of hard to cut through it. You said an interesting thing in the lead up to this visit, and in a Wall Street Journal article, you were quoted as saying, quote, as the administration looked at its global priorities, Saudi Arabia was relevant to a growing number of them, and having a scratchy relationship with the leadership was making a whole variety of things around the world harder. And I thought, close quote, but I also thought you added a Saudi perspective. Quote, from a Saudi perspective, a large part of the visit is intended to reinforce the importance of partnership with Saudi Arabia and refute the notion that the crown prince is an impetuous troublemaker and impossible partner, unquote. So we're a few days removed from the end of that visit. What's your assessment, and has it changed going in and to now coming out?
I think that the trip did a number of useful things from both a Saudi perspective and a U.S. perspective. As you say, there's a lot of commentary about how big a gesture it was, and was this a concession to the Crown Prince, and what did it mean? Was U.S. compromising all of its principles and all those things? To my mind, this wasn't as warm a visit as it might have been. And one of the ways you can see it is the difference in warmth between the president's trip to Israel just before and his time in Saudi Arabia. He was clearly more relaxed in Israel. He was happier in Israel. He had more standing relationships. He was more unscripted in Israel. But on the Saudi side, I think both sides would argue he did important things. He got important things done. There is a broad agenda that the governments have agreed on that they will pursue together. There is a commitment by the United States to remain in the region, which the Saudis and their neighbors had wanted. And it seems to me that in the world of presidential politics and presidential decision-making, when there's stuff you like to do and stuff you have to do, and stuff where you're thinking of creative new things and getting really enthusiastic and doing the kind of hard work that needs to be done. It feels like the Saudi visit was the hard work that needs to be done. It was done, and now it's time to move on and follow up on the agenda that the president and his partner sketched out.
I agree, and I think it's coverage was overwhelmed with the handshake or realism versus idealism and all these things, but there's a relationship and an absence in terms of U.S. involvement with that relationship. And I find it striking in our review today, and as I think we in our quoted, the one thing I put is a quote from Joe Biden that he said, quote, "The reason that I'm going to Saudi Arabia is we have an opportunity to reassert what I think we've made a mistake of walking away from, our influence in the Middle East," unquote. And I think a lot of people talk about deliverables and this sort of thing, but I think that's the main reason. And according to you, or what I hear you saying, is the beginning of that groundwork and the recovering some of that in terms of its relationships was accomplished in this trip.
Look, I think when the administration came in and it was committed to not getting overcommitted to the Middle East, and they went out all last fall and winter and talked about how we're aligning our goals and our resources, because for decades we had been pursuing these really extraordinary goals, but not putting the resources behind them. It's not that we're going to suddenly put extraordinary resources into the Middle East, but we're going to align our goals and our resources. But in so doing, they didn't actually say what our goals were, and they didn't say what our resources were. And the reasonable conclusion that people drew is, well, if you're not going to say what they are, we're going to assume worst case scenario, and they're nothing. And so this visit was an effort to fill in the blank that the administration had created by saying, what does the administration actually care about? What is the United States committed to? What are we willing to invest in? And what is the scope of activities we're going to focus on? The visit did that, I think, quite effectively. It is not an American abandonment of the region. It doesn't leave people wondering what the United States thinks about Iran. What does the United States think about regional proliferation? What does the United States think about Israeli security, partner security more broadly, prospects for defense cooperation? I mean, all kinds of things. I think we have a sense for what the administration's priorities are, that this is a genuine commitment that will be longstanding. I didn't see a sort of Biden doctrine to compare to the Carter doctrine, because it wasn't so much an assertion of something new. It was a reinforcement that everything hadn't changed. And when I was in Saudi Arabia in November, there was a concern that maybe the administration thought everything had changed, right? Because they kept talking about how things have changed, but they didn't say how. And now I think what you have is you have a sense of what the administration thinks the basal level of U.S. engagement should be. What's the normal level? What are the priorities the U.S. has? And it fills in the blanks for a region that had, I think, reasonably grown concern that the administration didn't have anything there. And now the administration said, this is what we care about. And it might not be everything that the Saudis might want. It might not be the sense of closeness. I still remember, I'm sure you remember, the picture of King Abdullah walking hand in hand at President Bush's ranch.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not that relationship. It's not going to be that relationship, but it's going to be a relationship. And to me, the most striking image was not this fist bump that showed up everywhere. It was instead the president gave a handshake to King Salman. It was the kind of respectful handshake between world leaders that you would expect to be normal. And to me, if anything, that's the message of this trip, is we're not walking away. There are a lot of reservations in the U.S. government about the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. But Saudi Arabia is important. And when the ruler of Saudi Arabia meets the president of the United States, it's going to be treated as an important statesman-like occasion. And I thought that handshake, which I said I've seen very little coverage of, but that handshake to me conveyed much more than the fist bump, which to me was a sign of there's something different here. It not only looked posed, but it looked negotiated. I mean, if you think about the fact that the Crown Prince wasn't smiling, the Crown Prince has a problem not smiling when he greets people, right? He just does. He smiles when he greets people. That's what he does. And he wasn't smiling, which made me think, I think this has all been negotiated. This is all delimited, right? There was no U.S. press allowed to take, but only the Saudi press. I mean, right. There's really an effort. We're going to get the iconic picture. And what the iconic picture of the visit to me, or what's been presented as the iconic image is this isn't normal. And the non-iconic image, but I think the important image, is the president having a normal handshake with King Salman, saying Saudi Arabia remains an important country to the United States, and the United States is the most important country to Saudi Arabia.
I think that's a very interesting take on it, and I think it's striking when in essence, the absence of clarity on whatever the pivot was or the reassessment was has led, particularly in the region, to runaway speculation. And the trip, as I hear you say it, helped us reclaim the narrative. And something you said really interesting. You said, and refutes the assertion, basically confirms the assertion that everything hasn't changed. It supports that, look, whatever this void that's been filled by media and speculation, we're here, I'm telling you right now, everything hasn't changed. We're still committed to the region and to this relationship. And I think it's absolutely critical. And I can't say anything with 100% confidence, but yes, I imagine every step of that was scripted, John.
If you could, you'd be in a think tank. It wouldn't be more right, but you'd certainly have the confidence.
So for our listeners and viewers, sort of two things happened in Jeddah. And actually, do you want to comment on his stop in Israel and Palestine?
I mean, to me, what was striking is when the president was in Israel, he was in his element. He knew people. You heard reports of asides he said to people he's had long relationships with. He knew all the parameters. He knew the right notes to hit. He was having fun, you would argue. I mean, the great thing, when he sees Benjamin Netanyahu, with whom he's had a very difficult relationship, right, he says, I love you, right? Which gets reported. But this is Joe Biden, the politician, working a place he knows well, he feels strongly about, he feels comfortable in, and working as a politician. And what struck me in both the Palestine part of the trip and the Saudi part of the trip is there wasn't that sense of intimacy, of comfort. There wasn't and you saw in the reporting, there wasn't the sort of ad-libbing. It's different for him. And to me, there's something about bookending the trip that way, that the Israel trip is Joe Biden in his element. And the Saudi trip is President Joe Biden pursuing what he believes American national interests to be, not necessarily with warmth and affection or enthusiasm or anything else, but marching through what he thinks the president of the United States needs to do. And to me, by juxtaposing the two, it kind of highlighted the difference in mood between the U.S. relationship with Israel and the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia.
And I think Joe Biden has made double-digit trips to the kingdom, so he's not. I mean, he's not unfamiliar with it. I hear what you're saying, John, but I mean, imagine if there was a straight line from Mohammed bin Salman's sort of, much covered and somewhat triumphant tour of the U.S. in March 2018 to here, and without Jamal Khashoggi in between.
Well, and the Ritz-Carlton, and I mean, there have been a whole series of issues, right?
True, but you could, a Ritz-Carlton, by comparison, isn't a domestic matter. This was obviously an extrajudicial, murder of someone in a foreign country, and so I guess what I'm saying is I don't disagree. I think that was the fact of the situation, but I wonder, so much of that overlay is from the weight, that the political hit that Biden perceives by doing this.
Look, I mean, here to me, here's the most important thing to keep in mind broadly. In early 2018, I heard any number of very senior Americans say, we have to ensure that MBS is successful, right? We have to ensure MBS is successful. Right. I haven't heard that since October 2018 from a single time. But I've started to hear people talk about it's important that Saudi Arabia is successful. It's only starting. I was arguing in 2018, we should be focused on Saudi Arabia, not Mohammed bin Salman. And I still think it's important for the United States that Saudi Arabia is successful in a lot of the experiments it's trying. And there are certainly some very encouraging things that come out and some very discouraging things that come out. But it seems to me that it's always going to be a problem when we reduce the relationship to one person, when the only prism we have for looking what's happening in Saudi Arabia is one person. I think it's a problem for Saudi Arabia to represent itself as only being the consequence of decisions of one person. To me, the really important thing for Saudi Arabia, and maybe, in a strange way, the last several years have almost forced this conclusion on Saudis, that it's important that people see this as a society in motion, that the responsibility be distributed, that the authority be distributed, that this really come and be appreciated to be much broader based than the traditional narrative, which I think is going to continue to run into resistance, that this is all coming out of the Crown Prince's creativity and brilliance, because ultimately one person can't transform a country of 20 million people.
It's interesting you say that, because it works in the reverse too, because Saudi Arabia, in identifying so closely with Donald Trump, created problems of their own. It narrowed their focus rather than the country to one leader. So just to sort of,
and I think, by the way, I think that Saudis continue to inadvisedly focus on either Donald Trump or the Republican Party and write off Democrats. Democrats are going to be a salient part of the U.S.-Saudi bilateral relationship for the next 50 years. Mm-hmm. And I think the Saudis would be very ill-advised to write off Democrats, because then you're going to have the U.S.-Saudi relationship seesawing back and forth rather than growing in an organic way. And I think there's plenty in Saudi Arabia for Democrats to be encouraged by, as much, and there are things that Democrats are troubled by. But I don't think it's wise at all for any country to align with one party in the United States, just as I think it's a mistake for the United States to align with one party in a foreign country.
John, let me take you back to Jeddah, because I think that there are two meetings. There was the Jeddah Security and Development Summit with the GCC states plus Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt. And there was also the bilateral with Saudi Arabia and the U.S. And in terms of messaging in the region, some interesting things came out of that Jeddah Security and Development Summit. Of note, the Iraq's energy integration with Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. They also, made some commitments in terms of food security, which is extremely important in the region. Right. Lined up $3 billion in support from GCC states for the U.S. Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. I thought, as I've mentioned before, these weren't home runs, but these were singles. And that I think these are sorts of things that will be well received in the region, and also consistent with how many people across the globe have perceived as being the best parts of U.S. foreign policy. Yeah,
but what was striking to me, and I don't know if you and Lucian agree, but there was a huge amount of attention the week prior that the president's going to Saudi Arabia. And in some ways, even the Israel visit, for all the attention it got, was seen as a sort of prelude to the big event of the president going to Saudi Arabia. Once the president had his first meeting with the Crown Prince, I felt like attention waned. Certainly we were in a weekend, and that didn't help. And you had the news from Joe Manchin, the climate negotiations. But it felt like by Saturday, after a week of fascination with this visit that was going to happen, it felt to me that by the time the president did the regional summit, everybody had moved on. There was very little press coverage. The stories got pushed way, way back in the newspapers. There really wasn't an effort to look at the substance of the discussions, which, are what the staff have been working on for several months on both sides. It just felt that there was this sort of made for TV moment of what kind of greeting would there be. And once people got over that, they lost interest. And, and I think from a governmental perspective, the point of the meeting was not, this was a part of sort of breaking the ice, but the really important piece of this meeting was setting an agenda the president had embraced, that the leaders in the region have embraced, that's going to be the agenda for the United States and the region for years to come. And it matters, as you know, it has a lot of different pieces, a lot of singles, a lot of very important initiatives, which are going to engage policymakers on both sides for many, many years. And that's good.
And I call that the signal, and all the rest of it is the noise.
It's the noise, yeah.
And I think you're 100% right, and that because the noise has fleeting interest, and it moves on. But I do think that the signal was very important, and I think it was received.
Yeah, but look, I think, to be honest, I think the Saudis demonstrated in many ways that they weren't delighted with how things were going. There was a certain lack of warmth in the way the president was greeted and sent off. There's a picture somebody showed me of the Crown Prince sort of making a dismissive look as the president was speaking. I mean, there's a certain sense of scratchiness that's still there, but I don't think we're going to get by the scratchiness. I don't think we're going to get by any scratchiness. I think what we're going to do is say, okay, we have work to do. Let's get on and do the work. It didn't heal all the wounds, but we have an agenda. We certainly have a lot of common interests. And here's a way we're going to build on them. I thought it was a little bit curious, frankly, that some of the press coverage asserted that this was all about Russia and China. I don't think it's all about Russia and China. I don't think that was the key thing. I think that the key thing is there's actually a lot to do with the United States, and let's go on and start doing it.
I think you're spot on. And I think, the scratchiness, as you say, certainly was prevalent, but I think that's the point of the meeting. There's been a distance and a remove and a little bit of animosity and shots across the bow and this sort of thing for 18 months now. Let's get in a room. And I think it's meaningful. I mean, much ado is made about Mohammed bin Salman, in response to being in discussion about Jamal Khashoggi, say, look, you've made mistakes too. And I think this is part of the process. I guess that's why I think the trip was important, because they needed to be back in dialogue. They needed to be working through these issues and hopefully, moving on to these singles and these operational G to G sorts of things that reaffirm and reassert and reassure that, as you say, everything hasn't changed with regard to the U.S. position to the region.
Well, and then the story that came out in the Wall Street Journal, which some people swear to me is true and some people swear to me isn't true, that the president tried to call out to Saudi Arabia and the UAE and couldn't get somebody to take his call. But the fact that the president has gone out, he's broken the ice, he's had the meeting, it gives you some momentum to build on, to have future engagements at the presidential level and below. And it does sort of break the ice that, people don't know that, people ascribe ideas to the president. Well, here's a bunch of ideas you can ascribe to the president, which are exactly what people want. And the president signed up for them. So let's have a relationship based on that, and not a relationship based on suppositions of what the president's really thinking. He doesn't really talk about the Middle East very much. And here's a bunch of language about the president's commitment to the Middle East that gives you something to work from.
And that was one reason. I mean, in the run-up, there's lots of discussion about normalization and the Middle East air defense security arrangement. What is he get in return in terms of oil and that sort of thing? All these things. I'm glad that chatter is passed, and we're on the other side of it. And that, as you say, it wasn't warm and fuzzy, but I think it was necessary and timely. You may not agree with that, but it seems to me it was necessary and timely.
No, I think so, and it, I think we both appreciate, and I think the press hasn't really covered it very widely. There are a lot of issues that got put on the table. A lot of issues were negotiated in advance. There is a pretty good bilateral agenda. There's a pretty good regional agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And as people looked and said, the United States is adrift in the Middle East, I think here you have a work plan for countries that want to work with the United States in the Middle East, with presidential endorsement, which will give people both stuff to work on and things to count on. So, that's, I think, what I think the way people have cast the whole visit is presidential visits are rewards, and you only get them if you've been a teacher's pet and checked all the boxes and all these things. And I think that's the president needed to assert a Middle East agenda. He asserted a Middle East agenda. Here are the parameters. Here are the tasks. Implicit in it, we're going to have resources to meet that. We expect some resources to come from the region. I think it's all, it's the work of government. It might not be the work of politics, but certainly the work of government.
I think that's really spot on and a good point. In the past, you've said, I think I recall, just correct me if I'm wrong, John, it can be the billionth time. The expectations from each party have missed at times. In other words, what our friends and Arab Gulf partners and have expected in terms of defense, may have been it may have been something other than reality. Whereas the U.S. has expectations. I guess what I'm getting to, does a discussion like this, and maybe it's too early, does it right size expectations? Are they talking about, all right, what's our security relationship going to be? Or is it too early?
I mean, so I didn't see anything in the public realm that suggested that there was a complete meeting of the minds. I know from speaking to senior diplomats on all sides that each side feels taken for granted. That I talked to folks in Gulf governments, and they say, how can you possibly suggest we're freeloaders? I mean, look at all the things we've done.
Right.
And you talk to people in the U.S. government and say, hey, those guys are a bunch of freeloaders. I mean, not everybody, but, there are voices on each side that feel like the other side takes us for granted. I think the way to address that is to actually work together, right? And to find common things that you do together that each contributes to, that there are areas of excellence for Gulf militaries. And I think the Emiratis have been the most aggressive in pursuing that and getting the respect of some people on the U.S. side. I think the Saudis are very interested in increasing their own indigenous military capacity, not because they want to replicate what the United States can do, but they want to be able to do a bunch of things themselves and want to complement what the United States does. And turning the military into that kind of military is a complicated process, which a lot of Americans and British are deeply involved in.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, frankly, I don't know when we're going to have complete mind meld on the security, on the security issues.
Right.
I think the United States being really far away might be more comfortable with deterrence than the Saudis might feel being really close to Iran. But it feels to me like, we're getting somewhat closer. And B, you don't want to be in a situation where you're not doing anything to get closer. And the resentment builds on both sides. So I think, getting closer, it's a process. It's going to take a long time, but I think it's an important process.
In our episode last week, I think it was my one big thing, Lucian, it might've been your one big thing. but I quoted Yasmin Farouk, and then she had commented in the New York Times, and she had said going into this, quote, the Saudis want to be treated as a U.S. partner, and today U.S. partners talk with the U.S. not just about security and oil, but also about technology, climate, and energy, unquote. I thought that was interesting because those three topics all came up.
They did all come up.
Yeah, and
But-
go ahead, sorry.
No, but I think that the challenge from the Saudi side is how can you be a partner not just following the United States,
Right.
but how can you come up with your own contributions that really move the ball forward? And I think this is where the Emiratis have been really skillful picking targets and figuring out how can they create a unique value proposition. I think the Saudis are still trying to figure out how does Saudi Arabia create a unique value proposition that is not just doing what not just acceding to U.S. requests,
Right.
but coming up with things on their own that advance U.S. interests. And so, sometimes I've had this conversation with Saudis and say, well, what kinds of things should we come up with? I said, that's for you to come up with. I mean, asking Americans visiting about what you can come up with doesn't mean you're coming up with your own ideas. And I think, this is a process, but I think it's an important process.
It's apropos to that point. It may not be, on the mark, but I think the timing of the trip was good because we're sort of 18 months into just really an explosion of regional diplomacy. And you could argue that Saudi Arabia is the center pivot of a lot that's going on. Obviously the UAE is now talking about an ambassador to Iran, but because of its bulk, its influence, they are the center pivot. So, and this is something.
And money, and money, and the
Yes,
Saudis
100%.
have been willing to deploy their economy in pursuit of diplomatic interests, other kinds of interests, power interests. And, that's one of the big differentiators for all that people sort of lump Saudi Arabia and the UAE together. Saudi economy is 4 times the size of the Emirati economy. It just is.
All right. So, as I said, I think we're in a bit of a diplomatic renaissance in the region, and people are talking, and it's a good thing. And I'm sure the U.S. I suspect the U.S. is very supportive of it. Pleased to see it.
Mostly. I mean, there's certainly things the U.S. isn't delighted with. The U.S. is less delighted with people growing closer to or having a broader relationship with China, for example. Right. I think there are aspects of a Russian relationship that people find concerning.
I'm really thinking within the region. De-escalating the issues with Qatar, Turkey and Saudi Arabia talking, Turkey and Egypt talking, the Emiratis and Qatar, movement on Yemen, or at least a truce on Yemen. These are all things that really have been generated from within the region, and I suspect we're pleased with and want to support and insofar as we can. So I guess plugging back in as this trip.
Yeah, and there are other issues. I mean, sometimes what's going on in Libya, from regional actors is troubling.
Yes.
So it's not all sweetness and light, but in general, an instinct toward dialogue, not only involving Israel, but certainly involving Israel as one of them. Mm-hmm. Dialogue with Iran, dialogue on Yemen, and certainly the Saudis and Emiratis have come together more on Yemen, which Americans are happy about and feel is constructive. So I think you're right that there's a big role for regional diplomacy, and I think there's an important role to be played by countries not only not the United States, but not taking direction only from the United States.
John, I think we're half hour into this.
I think that's really good. If I could actually just put a bow on it by telling everybody, if you haven't read it or you somehow missed it, Jon published a really great piece in late June, Rethinking Saudi Arabia, when the visit was announced. And I before talking with you today, Jon, I read through it and I was like, this could have been written today after the visit if you were to do it, with the full knowledge of what just happened. I mean, it's just fantastic. And that's on CSIS.org. it just is really good. I mean, you talk a lot about the sort of importance of the visit, but you sort of talk about the relationship in general and how, re-engaging with Saudi Arabia does not wipe away the country's mistakes. It does not prevent the company from making new ones. Those mistakes will rightly put a drag on how much people are willing to engage with the kingdom for some time to come, but refusing to re-engage on principle neither accelerates reforms nor improves conditions for Saudis or their neighbors. And the point is that we need to engage in order to make some changes if we want to make changes. Just stepping back does not, shying away from constructive roles to play, as you write, does not help. So that was a little long. I'm sorry about that, but you should definitely look that piece up because it's fantastic from Jon.
Thank you.
And let me do another.
There's this sense that everybody wants a U.S. good housekeeping seal of approval. But as long as I can remember, people have complained that the United States has been dispensing that good housekeeping seal of approval to people who don't deserve it. So maybe we should think less about the United States dispensing a good housekeeping seal of approval and just thinking the United States is pursuing its interests with a variety of countries, sometimes meeting with Mao Zedong, and sometimes meeting with Joseph Stalin, and sometimes meeting with, somebody you feel totally compatible with. But, the idea that we have to boil everything down to, if we're meeting, that means we have no issues or they've conceded all the things we'd ever want them to concede, and now we'll meet. I understand the instinct, and I understand the motivation behind the instinct, but it seems to me it's hard as an organizing principle for your policy that you'll only meet with people you agree with. I mean, the G7 is lovely.
It's a small world.
No, but it's not everything. And I understand it's a large part of the global economy, but there are a lot of problems the G7 can't fix. And the only way to fix them is if you engage more broadly with people who are less like you, not because you're saying there's nothing you disagree with, but to say that you have interest in narrowing your areas of disagreement, whether it's with China, whether it's with Saudi Arabia, whether it's with Russia. I don't hear anybody saying we shouldn't be meeting with Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping.
This is a rant I went on. I couldn't agree more. And if you're president and you don't want to travel, that's what you should subscribe to. This, that point of view. You're
just grumpy because you don't get miles for it anymore.
You do have the best PJ in the world, though. So
that's true.
Dr. Jon Alterman from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy, and host of Babel, which again, we must recommend. It's so terrific. The second best podcast out there next to ours. Dr. Alterman, thank you so much for joining us. This was terrific.
Lucien, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Jon.